Yeah.
That's great. Okay, so I want to welcome everyone to the Florida House Book Club. And this is Florida House on Capitol Hill. Florida House is the only embassy by a state in Washington, D.C. It was founded by Rhea Childs. And every Floridian can go up to, who visits in D.C., can go to the house, which is right by the United States Supreme Court, and have orange juice and say hello and see our wonderful exhibit right now, which is about the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And so one of the purposes of Florida House is to celebrate and champion and connect Florida to the world. And as a part of that mission, Florida House a few years ago launched a book club, and we read 4 books a year. And we go around the state in different areas of the state, and we try to cover different genres, and we try to cover diversity and topics and locations. Well, the last book of the year today is going to be about the Gulf, the making of an American Sea. And we are so lucky here to be with the author, Jack Davis. And here is Sundog Books, right in Seaside, not far from maybe where Jack grew up. And a perfect location. I think he wrote some of this book at this very spot. And it's really great for the group at Sundog Books, which Southern Living ranked as one of the top bookstores in the South, to host us. We're so thrilled to be here. Thank you for everyone who's here in the audience. And we are excited to finish our season with a book about the Gulf, which we think is a new classic. And we really recommend every Floridian to get this book and put it in their library. It will certainly be in the library at Florida House in Washington, D.C., so if you're up there, you can see all of the books that we have read so far. And if you're interested in that, you can go to our website, and that is Florida House on Capitol Hill. You can learn about our bookstores that we work with, independent bookstores, and all the books. But I want to introduce Jack Davis. He is a professor of history, and he is the Rothman Family Chair in the Humanities, specializing in environmental history and sustainability at the University of Florida. He has written and edited 10 books. I hear this is your favorite. That's what someone said. And so he won the Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for this book. This is really a fabulous piece of literature, and we were thrilled to be able to connect with Jack today to talk about it. The Tampa Bay Times said that it was splendid, packed with research, but it doesn't read like a textbook. And I think that's right. It is full of facts, neatly organized, but it really does seem like you're having a conversation with Jack like we're going to have today. So first, I want to talk to you about what was the inspiration for writing this book.
Well, I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico, so I have this lifelong intimate relationship with the Gulf. And whenever I'm away from it, I really feel a hole in my life, if you will, a vacancy, and I'm always eager to get back to the Gulf. I live in Gainesville now, which is landlocked in the middle of Florida, but I like to think that the westerly breezes are coming off the Gulf and greeting me, and of course when hurricanes come through, that's exactly what's happening. But I spent, as a kid, I spent all my time on the water, and I saw a need as an author to write this book because nobody had written a book like this about the Gulf of Mexico. They've written about other seas, and the Gulf sort of gets just lost in the larger American historical narrative. And I find that very disturbing. So, the subtitle of the book is The Making of an American Sea. And I wanted readers to know that no matter where they live in this country, that they're all connected to the Gulf, whether they've seen it or not, both ecologically and historically.
Which is really great. So I wanted to ask you, you write in the book that this is a book of the discovery of sea of many ages and civilizations and all the different populations, and you sort of begin chronologically with the different populations. Do you want to go through some of those a little bit? One of the facts he talks about is that the Native American populations used to winter on the barrier islands, and they will go away during the summer, and I think some things have never changed. I think that's still how we are today. People all over the country and the world come to our barrier islands, and they winter, and then they leave, right? So I thought that was really pretty amazing. Things never change.
Things never change, yeah. And there were exceptions to those seasonal migrations, and one of those exceptions was the Clusa, who lived in Southwest Florida, which really fascinating native peoples who are sedentary but not agrarian, which is a rare case. Typically, when you're sedentary, you have agriculture, but they didn't have to grow agriculture. They lived right on the Gulf, in the estuaries down in Southwest Florida, brought them everything they needed. Some 95% of the protein came from the estuaries, but not just food, but also tools and weapons, and they crafted so much out of what they gathered from the estuarine environment. And when the Spanish came along, and others to the Gulf of Mexico, whether they're on the Texas coast or Florida coast, they often commented in their documents and diaries that there were so many fish in the sea that it would stop vessels in their tracks. And so that was the kind of environment that indigenous people around the Gulf of Mexico.
And the Spanish, I think he writes in the book, called them giants. they were large.
Oh yeah,
right?
these quite healthy people, and they were
larger than the Spanish.
They were taller than the agrarian Spanish,
right?
And they were like gods to them, and physically, and so clearly healthy people, and who've been here for anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 years.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing. So he writes that the history of the Gulf is the history of America. And one of the things we have to give credit for is Thomas Jefferson. He saw that the Spanish-controlled Gulf really was fundamental to our future. But the Spanish then were the next to really come in and sort of discover the Gulf. And obviously, we will talk about things that are Florida-centric because we represent Florida House and we promote all things Florida. But we were named by Ponce de Leon.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's kind of fun. You might want to talk about his demise.
Yeah, well, I was talking about the Calusa. They were responsible for his demise because, he wasn't just simply an explorer. He was a conquistador, and he was on a mission to find precious metals here, but also to enslave native peoples because the labor population in the Caribbean had been so diminished by European diseases and overworking. And the Calusa said, "We don't want anything to do with you, Ponce. Go away." And they made that known immediately. And he made 2 attempts to settle Southwest Florida. And in the second attempt, he was hit in apparently the thigh with a spear or a dart that had been poisoned by the machineel sap or the sap of the machineel tree, and he died from his wounds.
Right, yes. I mean, he did name our state La Florida, right? So
yes.
That was good. And I believe you're right that Christopher Columbus found his way to the New World, but Ponce de Leon found the way back. He found the Gulf Stream. I think that's what you say in your book. Yes,
that's exactly right. That's probably one of his great contributions to that period of discovery was it turned out that the Gulf Stream was extremely important to the movement of cargo and gold, in particular gold and silver in particular, back to Europe from the Gulf of Mexico. A ship crossing the Atlantic on the Gulf Stream could take a week or 2 off of its travel time. That, of course, it meant less food and water they'd have to have, but it also kept them off the water that was filled with pirates looking for that gold and silver. Right. So less time on the water, the less the risk of you being found by those thieving sailors out there.
So De Soto was next, and he, I think, celebrated the first Christmas in Florida, right around Tallahassee.
That's correct.
Which is pretty cool. But what I really liked was when Jack was talking about how the Spanish had unfavorable opinions of Florida, and they thought it was the, quote, the worst country warmed by the sun, quote. And so, or another quote is, a land so strange and so bad and so lacking in resources, either for staying or leaving. And so, the Spanish wanted nothing to do with Florida, really. And they treated us to the Brits. They
did. Florida was important to them, not because Florida never paid for itself when it was a Spanish territory. The 2 times it was a Spanish territory. And the only reason why the Spanish really held on to it is for strategic reasons, because to try to protect that the shipment of gold and silver coming from Mexico through the Gulf Stream. And yes, they did give the British had possession of Florida, the Floridas, East Florida and West Florida, for some 20 years. A lot of people don't. This is one thing that bothers me about American history being so New England centric. Is that there weren't 13 colonies, there were 15 British colonies, and your typical survey history textbook doesn't write about East Florida and West Florida. They just get lopped out of the narrative.
Another thing that he wrote that I did not know is that the English were the British were the ones who actually named the remnants of various Native American tribes that had moved down into the Florida Peninsula, the Seminole. I didn't realize that name came about from the British, which I think is interesting. Do you have any idea what the meaning behind that was? Or?
You know, it's uncertain. And I had a graduate student once who actually wrote his master's thesis on the origin of the word Seminole, and he read virtually every treaty he could find between Native peoples of Florida. Some say that and it could be that the name came from Native peoples themselves, but what he did learn is that they did accept it. It wasn't imposed upon them, and it typically referred to multiple groups. It could be members of the Yamasee, members of the Creek and Choctaw, all mixed in one, and used mainly in East Florida. And it was a way to identify this myriad group of Native peoples. But they use that, and Native peoples use that to their advantage as a way of, a form of cohesion and, uniting against the British and ultimately the United States.
And then the Americans, right?
And then the Americans. And also the Spanish, because Spanish came back for a little while, and then the Americans took Florida away from the Spanish.
Yes, that's right. So Thomas Jefferson wanted the Gulf Shores. He'd never come to the Gulf, but he could read a map, as you say, and he realized it was going to be really important. He wanted Cuba, too. He didn't get Cuba. But he had Andrew Jackson chase the Spanish away, I guess, right?
Well, it's uncertain whether Washington had Andrew Jackson do anything, and maybe that Andrew Jackson just did it. And anybody knows anything about Andrew Jackson, probably... we can probably assume that he took the initiative, and he did. He didn't. Slaves and the enslaved were running away from Georgia and Carolina and even Tennessee plantations to Spanish Florida and taking refuge among the Seminole, and the Spanish were giving them refuge as well. And so he wanted to stop that. He wanted to stop that. The original. Underground Railroad went south. People don't realize this, rather than north. Because thousands, hundreds if not thousands of enslaved left plantations to move down to Spanish Florida. And that's really regarded by many historians as the first Underground Railroad.
I don't think that's in the book.
Yeah. I don't know if I mentioned that or not, but I should have if I
Super great. So in 1819, the U.S. gets Florida from Spain, and that means Florida's contribution is 770 miles of Gulf front, half of the U.S. Gulf coastline. And you talk next in the book about the fishing frontier and Leonard Destin. Here we are on the Emerald Coast now, and you might talk about that.
Yeah, the thing is, the Spanish occupied the Gulf, the French occupied the Gulf, and the British occupied the Gulf. And none of those powers really developed a commercial fishing industry in the Gulf of Mexico. The British started doing it, but they weren't here very long. Those other powers more interested in land products, particularly timber and deer skins. And but the Americans recognized, boy, this wealth of seafood swimming around the Gulf of Mexico. And so the original American commercial fishers were New Englanders who would come down in the wintertime, smart them, our original snowbirds, that's exactly right. But they'd also fished out, much of the North Atlantic. And so they came down to the Gulf of Mexico for fresh catches, and often they would stay just a season. Now, Leonard Destin ended up staying, and others did too, permanently on the Gulf. And they're really responsible for launching the commercial fishing industry. You could go to Pensacola in the late 19th century, and the names you would see on the side of fish houses in Pensacola, which is probably the busiest commercial fishing port on the Gulf of Mexico in the late 19th century. The names you saw on the side of the fish houses were New England names.
Isn't that crazy?
People
You
from
don't think
Connecticut and
Pensacola
Maine.
is New England?
Yeah, Pensacola is very proud of its Spanish heritage, its Confederate heritage. I don't think it knows anything about its Yankee heritage.
I know. You never see anything when you go visit it, which is
They
interesting.
may know, and they're just keeping a secret.
So you write that, you know, Destin was known as the world's luckiest fishing village, and it was America's best fishing hole. I think you said in 1971, 42% of the U.S. catch came from this whole area around Destin. I don't know if that's a pretty big statistic, right?
Yeah, I don't remember that but if it's in the book, I'm sure. It's,
So you say there are two fish.
it's gospel.
Exactly. There are two fish that you need to know, and one is about the red snapper, which they fished in Pensacola.
Yes, the
Right.
red snapper. They fished across the northern Gulf. It was really the first important commercial fish coming out of the Gulf that was sent elsewhere and to other parts of the country. And it was plentiful, and it's the fish that really launched the fishing industry in Pensacola. And they're fishing it around the same time that we are getting ice and then ultimately refrigeration. So commercial fishers weren't just selling their fish locally, maybe as far as New Orleans or someplace, but with ice you could actually ship those red snapper up to Delmonico's in New York.
And Jack writes that really that's the basis of the Southerners' love for iced tea. It's that ice from Pensacola that was for the fish.
Another Yankee contribution to the Southern culture.
I had never heard that before.
I mean, ice from Walden Pond came down south, and I'd like to think some of it ended up on the front porches of in mint juleps and iced tea and everything else.
So I think organizing all of the material in this book would have been an amazing feat. And we talked briefly before we went live about how you did that. But he goes through lots of different fish. So we'll just go quickly. Oysters, for example. Oysters are next in your list behind red snapper. And you say, the French called this area the kingdom of oysters.
Yeah, it really was. We think if we think nationally of oysters, we think of the Chesapeake and even New York Harbor. But this place, there was just a wealth of oysters all around the Gulf of Mexico, from Texas to Florida, and these massive oyster beds. And so here's the other thing with the Spanish in seafood, and they wanted to avoid the oyster bars because they threatened their ships. When they saw an oyster bar, they weren't seeing a commercial product. They were seeing something threatening. But enterprising Americans come along and say, and there's a huge market for oysters up in New York because they had fished out and polluted the New York harbor, and so they needed to get oysters from elsewhere.
So they came down here, and Jack talks about shrimp and sponges and mullet and turtles, and then you get to recreational fishing, and you say the second fish we all need to know about is the tarpon.
Yeah.
The tarpon, and that was the basis of the recreational fishing industry, you say in this book.
It really set it on fire. The first tarpon caught by, at least on record, that was caught by hook, was caught down in Pine Island Sound near Fort Myers in Sanibel. Actually, right there at Tarpon Bay at Sanibel, and in 1885 by a New York architect who was down commercial fishing, and everybody knew the tarpon would be a great fighting fish, but nobody had figured out how to hook one. This architect, whose name for some reason is escaping me right now, was able to hook the first one and write about it. And just news of this spread like wildfire. And people from the Northeast, the Midwest, from the British Isles are converging on Southwest Florida, which didn't have railroad.
Right. Henry Plant hadn't put them in yet.
Not yet. Henry Plant did not put his railroad in yet. And one reason why he didn't run his railroad down to the Fort Myers region was tarpon. And he wanted to bring tarpon fishers down, recreational fishers down, and he did. Our first in I mean, this is long before people are beachgoers, you know, at least down in the South. They're not thinking about. They're not coming to Florida to go to the beach. Our first tourists come here to catch fish.
To fish, which is really interesting. And again, nothing has really changed. He talks about how people would come to Florida, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, and go down to St. John's, and they were looking for exotic wildlife, just like people go on safari today. Nothing has changed. And so then Henry Plant, with the railroad, was diverting people over sort of to the Gulf, which was a phenomenon.
Yes, Henry Flagler, of course, built his railroad down the East Coast, Henry Plant down the West Coast, and really opened up the Tampa Bay area and in the Fort Myers area.
And in the book, he talks about how, you know, people from Naples was settled by folks from Kentucky, and Cortez, folks from North Carolina. It really is fascinating. You can just pick a beach community, and he's really probably hit it, which is super. And then you sort of go into the whole discussion about birds and how, you know, people at one time came to Florida to look at the flora and fauna, and then we had sort of a problem with the hat industry, with the bird population.
Right. As you were saying earlier, that people, you know, Florida's tourism started in the interior of Florida. People like Harriet Beecher Stowe wanting to see the exotic wildlife of Florida, and particularly the bird life on the rivers and in the freshwater springs, and eventually commercial or recreational fishing brings them out to the coast, where the bird life there is also spectacular.
Right.
But sadly, at the same time that people started catching tarpon in the late 19th century, others were coming to Florida from elsewhere to shoot birds because the egret's mating feathers were literally worth their weight in gold. And yeah, and so I mean, there's a big demand in the fashion industry for feathers for hats, women's hats in you know, in the Paris markets and London and New York, and we hunters could wipe out a rookery of 100,000 birds, which was not unusual, like at Maximo Rookery in St. Petersburg, in a matter of weeks.
And he talks about how, which I thought was so interesting, that in terms of the snowy egret, more buffaloes survive the Great Plains than snowy egrets survive on the Gulf. You know, that's just you know, we think about the buffalo, but we're not thinking about the demise of the snowy egret, which is really quite interesting.
Right. Yeah.
But then it seems like the Audubon shot the snowy egret and posted for his painting. But Audubon societies then, around the turn of the century, the very women who were buying hats then started conservation.
Yeah. I mean,
which is quite interesting.
It really.
Petersburg.
You're absolutely right. The hat fashion industry not only devastated the wild bird population, you know, primarily wading birds with beautiful feathers, but also launched the conservation movement. And it's women who are real leaders behind it. There were more women who found Florida Audubon than men. And they founded Florida Audubon, and before National Audubon was organized 5 years.
Amazing?
Yeah, 5 years earlier, and they really pushed for a national organization to save the birds. And Florida women were extremely instrumental in the conservation movement.
So that's something we can all be proud of. His next chapter is really about beaches, and he writes, "You write, Jack, when you walk on the beach, you walk on mountains." And you want to elaborate about that? I hadn't thought about that.
Right. No, not very many people. We have these beautiful quartz white sand beaches in Florida, and particularly on the Panhandle, and those beaches are a gift of nature. Our tourist industry, our cheap tourist industry, beach going, is a gift of nature. And that white quartz sand is not local. It comes from the Appalachian Mountains.
Isn't that amazing?
You know, eons ago, the Appalachian Mountains were as tall as the Himalayas. And over the years, rain and wind and wash brought the sediment down into streams and rivers, down into the Gulf of Mexico. And the nearshore currents would carry the sand and build these beautiful beaches that we have.
Which is super.
Yeah, I know, isn't it? It's a wonderful story, isn't it?
It's a great
So the American Sea, just another example of the Gulf's connection to other parts of the country.
the rest of the country. And you write that Florida beaches might be the whitest in the world. You kind of next go into the growth movement and then the tourism movement, all the good roads movement, and the fact that all roads in Florida lead to riches, and you start talking about development along the coastline, which can lead to our current state of development, I guess, down on the West Coast in particular.
Yes. So there's a development boom in the 1920s, and places like St. Petersburg and Tampa and Sarasota on the Gulf side, and of course Miami and Fort Lauderdale on the Atlantic are just booming. And that comes to a halt with the Great Depression. But World War II introduces millions of military men and women to Florida. We had something like 172 military installations in Florida during World War II. The climate was favorable, land was cheap. You had conditions that were similar to fighting in the Pacific, and so these men and women who were introduced to Florida during World War II, many of them liked what they saw, and they either stayed or they came back at some point in their lives. And of course, then we had, at the same time after World War II, starting in the 1930s, but really kicks in after World War II, we have Social Security. So we have retirees that don't necessarily have to stay at home with their kids up north, and so they're coming to Florida after World War II, retiring to Florida, and then the next boom really comes. Of course, we had the oil embargo and 1970s recession, but we also had Disney World. That ignited another building boom after the 1970s, and the Florida coast became discovered. The Barrier Islands were developed, bridges were built. The Army Corps of Engineers was very accommodating to this development, commercial development, and unfortunately, I would argue we made some mistakes along the way, and in the 21st century, we've got some challenges that if we had, I think, been more cautious about, more controlled with our growth on the coast, we wouldn't. These challenges wouldn't be so dramatic today.
Right. Well, another section he writes about hurricanes, and I had no idea that hurricanes really the word came from a Mayan god.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I mean, you said it. The Spanish are the first to use the term and to adopt it from the indigenous people of the Yucatan, and hurricane became hurricane,
right.
And ultimately somewhere along the line it evolves into hurricane, and at least that's what we call storms of that nature in the North Atlantic, meaning above the equator.
And it's the hurricane god was the divine source of wind and storms and birth and destruction.
Yeah,
and that's pretty appropriate.
Yeah.
Spanish were all wrong.
I mean, because when there's destruction, in nature, there's rebirth afterward. There's creation. Creation follows destruction. And that's I think one of the marvelous things about nature is that it'll recover from its own assaults much quicker than it'll recover from ours. But it's also shown that when we step in and do things right, it recovers really quickly. And we've done that a lot in Florida. I think we reached our nadir in the 1970s when virtually all of our nearshore waters were polluted by wastewater and industrial pollution. And not swimmable, fishable. I could hardly catch a fish in Tampa Bay when I was a kid.
Really?
Never saw birds other than brown pelicans or gulls. And I could catch a croaker, but big deal. If I got lucky, really lucky, a speckled trout. But now, I mean, we've cleaned up these bays and bayous around the country, and particularly around the Gulf, and brought them back to teeming life. Now there are all kinds of fish and all kinds of birds.
And the mangroves, that's another interesting story. He talks about the mangrove coast, which was from Homosassa Springs to Key West. He talks about the different kinds of mangroves, but you write that the mangrove forests are more effective than like the Amazon tropical forest that we always hear about in combating CO2 and climate change. Now, when have you all ever heard that? I mean, I've never heard that in the media. I just think that's fascinating.
I was telling my environmental history class at the University of Florida the first day, I said, if you remember anything from this class, I want you to remember this, that acre by acre, an estuarine environment, a mangrove forest, a seagrass bed, absorbs more carbon out of the air than a wooded environment. And you're right, we don't hear about that. It's a win-win-win with estuarine environments. They're buffers against intense weather. They are birthplaces and habitat, and they absorb carbon.
Which is really great.
Yeah.
And he sort of ends with some success stories. Do you want to talk about Seminole and Captiva? And,
Sure, yeah.
Well,
Sanibel is one of those places that early on recognized that it didn't want to experience the same kind of growth that other parts of Florida, not just Florida, other parts of the American coast had experienced. They wanted to control it. And so very effectively established a smart growth plan there. And it, there, I've forgotten what percentage of Sanibel is natural environment, but it's a larger proportion of the island. And anybody who's been to Sanibel can certainly see that. And and of course Seaside. I mean, the original vision of Robert Davis was to create an old Florida communal environment that really interacted closely with the natural surroundings, and I think
no fertilizer,
no fertilizer,
indigenous plants, protecting the dunes.
Yeah, and what's interesting, a lot of people don't know is that the picket fences in front of all the homes have the purpose of slowing down traffic. He didn't want speed humps. And it does. He learned and studied that those picket fences make the road look narrower, and it may not be. And people just respond, react by slowing down. And so there are success stories like that. And then Cedar Key, I end the book on the story of Cedar Key. This is a place that is very much old Florida. It was had since the 19th century depended on commercial fishing, but by the late 20th century, the waters were too polluted for oystering and clam fishing there. But also, Florida had imposed the gill net ban, and that just wiped out the income, the multi-generational income of many fishing families in Cedar Key. So the state of Florida, the University of Florida as well, and others said, well, let's do clam culture here. Let's do aquaculture here and raise clams. But the water wasn't quite clean enough. And so the state stepped in, the university came in and said, well, this is how we can fix it. We'll clean this water. And so they had to get rid of septic tanks locally in Cedar Key and go to a centralized wastewater treatment system. Same with better septic tanks up the Swanee River, and they cleaned up the water. And now economically, the clam fishing or aquaculture in Clam-a-Lot, as many people call it, has been more successful than commercial fishing ever was. And they got along. The other thing they got with it was clean water. They cleaned up their environment. So here's a great story in which you have both a clean environment and a robust economy.
Which is just great, which is what Florida hopes for in the future. I just think this story is great. I'd love for you to end our presentation with you reading just a short excerpt from your book.
Okay, this is just the last paragraph of the prologue that I'll read. And it pretty much sums up what I learned from growing up on Florida and in researching and writing this book. The Gulf and its history, its biography, one might say, should be celebrated, not mourned. The American Sea has long been and will continue to be a gift to humankind. It brings beauty into our lives and invigorates the human spirit. It gives us food, moderates our climate, removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and puts oxygen we breathe into the same. There's a kind of nourishing energy out in the Gulf that doesn't pump from a well. It is a wholeness of living things, the dynamic energy moving from sun to plant to animal, a ceaseless flow that in the long scheme of things is far more important than mineral deposits to our future existence.
Isn't that lovely? That's a taste of her beautiful writing. Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Does anyone here at Sundog have a question for Professor Davis?
Yes.
It's not just a Florida question, but
Sure.
you have the Gulf obviously goes from Texas all the way around, and what is from your studies, do all the states kind of treat the Gulf the way in a similar manner, or do they approach it with some diversity?
Yeah, well, the other four, there are 5 U.S. states on the Gulf of Mexico, and the other 4 states all have oil. We don't. We've been very smart in keeping oil away from our shorelines, or oil exploration and drilling and platforms. And it's not just the platforms. People don't always get this. Not just what's out in the Gulf. The real assault from the petrochemical industry is onshore, with the infrastructure that supports the offshore. Louisiana is losing 25 to 30 square miles of land, coastal land, a year to erosion. And that's primarily from 10,000 miles of petroleum industry canals that cut through this spectacular estuarine environment, one of the largest coastal marshlands in the world. And sadly, it's disappearing. And so there are places like in Houston, in the Houston Ship Channel and Galveston Bay, there are some 300 or more toxic spills a year in that bay, and mainly because of the shipping canal or channel. And I mean, we have them here too, sadly, and we're getting spills on occasion in Tampa Bay. We've done just such a good job of bringing that bay back to teeming life, and it'd be a shame for us to see things go in the opposite direction. But all around the Gulf of Mexico, people very much care. Love this Gulf, love the bays and the bayous and the estuarine environments. And virtually every community has some organization that is trying to protect those waters. And these are not just simply environmental groups. These are human interest groups, because they recognize that when we have clean water, when we have a clean environment, we have personally, as humans, we have a better quality of life.
That was a really great question. Is there another question out there?
Yes.
2 things. I'm interested in your comments on the 15 colonies. Of course, most of us here probably learned about the 13 colonies.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the reason for not talking about the 2 Florida colonies is, and when were they established, I guess, in relation to the ones that we've all studied? And the other thing is, in your book, you mentioned the competition between Pensacola and St. Augustine for the earliest settlement in the U.S.
Oh,
Of course, I always heard St. Augustine is the earliest town or city in the U.S. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So let me answer the first question about the 15 colonies. East Florida and West Florida, or Florida had been Spanish up until 1763, and then the British acquired Florida, and they saw it as too big for a single province or a single colony, so they created East and West Florida. And so we got Pensacola as the capital of West Florida, and St. Augustine as the capital of East Florida. And they remained British until 1783, until the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty after the Revolution. And I should also say that Florida West Florida went all the way to the Mississippi, and as far north as approximately Montgomery, Jackson, or so. And as far as the Spanish tried before settling St. Augustine in 1565. They tried settling Pensacola. It seemed like an ideal protected harbor, and fairly deep, at least in those days, deep enough for their ships, and close to Mexico, which was ideal for them as well, because that's where all their gold and silver was. And despite this protected harbor, a hurricane came along and wiped out the fleet, which is still there underwater. And that's one reason why University of West Florida has one of the best underwater anthropology programs in the country. And so the Spanish, became a little skittish about Pensacola after that. And so St. Augustine was ultimately became the first permanent European city in what became the United States. As my former colleague Mike Gann used to say, by the time the British settled Jamestown, Spanish St. Augustine was in urban renewal.
Yes, St. Augustine says they have the first things, really.
That's right. That's right.
Did that answer both of your questions?
Yes.
I learned so much from your book, and I think every Floridian should read that book. But I still have great concerns about hurricanes and how fast they're coming, and how strong they are, and about red tide when it hits us, and about whether it's safe to eat oysters.
Those are all legitimate concerns, and we're learning more and more about hurricanes in the 21st century. And that, I mentioned one of our great environmental challenges. I talk about environmental challenges in the 21st century, and hurricanes certainly are that. And we're recognizing that. Barrier Islands. If I'd been the boss, back in the day, I would have said no building on the Barrier Islands with the knowledge I have today. Because that's think of the term Barrier Islands. They protect the mainland. But when we build out on Barrier Islands, such as we, stacked up condos on Barrier Islands, they're no longer protective barriers. They become vulnerable, or at least our material culture becomes vulnerable. Red tide, I don't like to use that term, because red tide is a natural event. And what we are seeing in Southwest Florida, it may be some red tide, but I refer to it, and a lot of people hate me for this, and Ben Sass, the president of University of Florida, may get letters, but I call it cow tide and sugar tide. And because what's coming down from Lake Okeechobee, which drains, sugar, other parts, cattle agriculture, but also grass sod industry. And I have nothing against agriculture. Agriculturalists are some of our, they appreciate the land. They've done so much to help Florida, and the wildlife corridor, for instance. But we have a real problem with Lake Okeechobee, and we're killing the estuarine environment because of what's coming out of Lake Okeechobee down the St. Lucie River and the Caloosahatchee River. And those are toxic blooms, algae blooms. I don't like to call them red tide, and because then we blame nature and we let ourselves off the hook when we do that.
One of the things he talks about hurricanes is a statistic you give in the book is that the Gulf averages 2 hurricanes a year, and that Gulf states are hit 15% more with hurricanes than other states, and that Gulf dwellers have to flee danger more often than any other Americans. And I had never really thought about that. But having looked around the Gulf, I have fled danger, so I get it. That is an interesting factor that a lot of people around the country don't appreciate. So I thought that was really interesting. And then you do go into a lot of detail about some of the significant hurricanes, like the one that hit in 1935. That Hemingway
the
wrote
Key
about.
West, the Thanksgiving hurricane of 1935. really brought an end to the Flagler Railroad, and you know, of course, they were building the overseas, quote unquote, overseas highway at the time, and some 500 workers, many of them indigent men who were victims of the Great Depression, many of them World War I veterans. Some 500 men were killed in that hurricane, who were building the overseas highway. But despite that hurricane, we went ahead and built that overseas highway.
Oh no, of course. Once again, though, he details how, you know, the Spanish name for Key West was what, Bone Island, and the Spanish called the Keys basically the word for martyred, and then one key, what was it, Manacumba Key, is that it?
Mm-hmm.
It was Killman, and that is exactly where that 1935 hurricane hit. I mean, they were a little prophetic about how deadly the Keys were.
Right. Yeah.
And
there are a lot of prophetic events in history.
I guess you talked about one of the hurricanes in Miami in 1926. It was a Miami hurricane, but it wiped Sanibel, Queens.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is
it
amazing.
came right across the state. Yeah.
Which is crazy. And he talks about how there are 50 barrier islands. He calls them bumpers in the Gulf in Florida. 50
or front bumpers. I think
front bumpers. That's it. Front bumpers. I had never thought of a barrier island as a front bumper.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah.
So, do we have other questions?
What about the Oyster?
Well, yeah.
What about the oysters? What do you want to know?
Oh, yes, that's right. The answer to the
Oh,
question, our oysters.
you know,
Yes,
you know, it's so localized, the contamination of oysters. So some places are fine, some places not so. But there are always bulletins, and so you just have to pay attention to the bulletins. And you know, oysters are filter feeders, and think, oh, oysters will keep the water clean. They will to some extent, but you can also overload them, and they overload them to the point that they become too dangerous to eat. And but you just have to keep your eye on local bulletins if you're concerned about oysters. And you know, if there's sadly, it's been more and more frequently if there's raw sewage being pumped into Tampa Bay because you know, the municipalities can't keep up with it. The demand, I wouldn't be eating oysters out of Tampa Bay, or you know, at least check local sources to find out.
What about Apalachicola?
Apalachicola, sadly, is you know, its oyster industry doesn't really have much of a future, and that's sad. To no fault of Apalachicola, and this is the long, decades-long battle the state of Florida's had with Georgia and big-bellied Atlanta, but Apalachicola has persevered. I mean, it's really become this really wonderful arts community. It's rebranded itself, and that may not be great for oyster families who have been doing this for generations, but people find they persevere too, and so Apalachicola is a great place to visit, but it's the industry there is just all but dead, I would say, sadly. Yes.
I have a question. I was wondering if you could speak about the Pulitzer and winning.
Oh, great question.
And what that process was like.
It was a very interesting experience. It was April 16th, 2018, and I had no idea that the book was even being considered. I didn't even know they were announcing the Pulitzers. They don't announce finalists beforehand with the Pulitzer like they do with the National Book Award. So you know who the 3 finalists are, and then a few weeks later you find out who wins. That's not the case with the Pulitzer. And I wasn't paying attention to anything. Because again, I didn't even know they were being announced on that day. But I was happened to be in my office in a meeting with a graduate student in a writing seminar that semester, near the end of the semester, and I was reading him the riot act about his sloppy writing for the semester, and having a good time. And my office phone rings, my cell phone rings, but texts are coming in, and it's really getting annoying because I am, as I said, having a good time. And finally I said, my God, maybe there's an emergency. I should check. And I picked up my phone and saw a text from my editor and said I had won the Pulitzer. And I stood up and said, "Holy S." And then I literally had no word. I lost my ability to speak. And I couldn't tell the grad student what was going on. I had to slide the phone across the desk to him, and for him to read the text, and his eyes bug out. And I like to say, I know what he was thinking. Oh, good, meeting's over. And so that's how I learned about it. And I always ride my bike to campus. And I was in my office for another couple hours on the phone with the press. And I'm riding home that day. And I'm just looking out and saying, God, of all days, don't let me get hit by a car.
That's a great way to end our conversation. Thank you so much. This was really a lot of fun.
Absolutely my pleasure. It was lots of fun.
You are so nice to come over here to Sundog. We really want to thank everyone here at Sundog who's worked so hard to make this a possibility. What a privilege it is to be here. We do invite all of you to come up to Washington, D.C. and to come to Florida House on Capitol Hill and come have a glass of orange juice and feel like you're a bit at home. We'll try to give you a little bit of sunshine, even if it's a snowy day. And we'd love for you to see our current art exhibit, the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And I also want all book club fans to know that we will meet next on Wednesday, November 29th, and we are going to review holiday picks, books for holiday gift giving. And it was very popular last year. We're coming back. It was really fun to see what the independent booksellers who have partnered with us have suggested for holiday gift giving. And you can go on our website, Florida House on Capitol Hill, to see who those independent booksellers are. And you can follow along for updates on that as well. We really want to thank everyone for joining us. Don't forget to watch or follow Florida House DC on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And thank you all again for just a wonderful evening. Thanks so much. It was really great.
Oh, good. It's fun.
Love hearing about the
Yeah, I'm glad that was.
his book on